My name is Elaine, and I'm 47 years old now, sitting by a window on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, watching the light shift across the wooden floor of a house I never expected to live in, married to a person I never expected to fully know, and finally at peace with a truth that took most of my adult life to understand. I want to tell you a story, but I want to tell it the way you'd tell it to an old friend on a long walk, without rushing to the punchline, without pretending the difficult parts were easier than they were. I want to talk about my husband, whose name is Daniel, and how about 7 years ago, I started noticing small changes in him that I couldn't at first explain, and how those changes slowly, gently, painfully, and beautifully opened a door in our marriage that I had never known was there. Some of what I share here will be about him, but a lot of it will be about me too, because when someone you love begins to change, you don't just watch from a distance. You're pulled into your own reckoning, your own history, your own quiet corners you had never examined. I share this not as a spectacle, not as a headline, and not because I want anyone to think our life is unusual or dramatic. I share this because I believe that stories about identity, about the private work of becoming who we are, deserve to be told carefully, and because I've come to think that the more of us who speak honestly about these things, the fewer people will spend decades feeling alone in the dark. I met Daniel when we were both 24, at a bookstore in a small city, where I had just moved for a job I no longer remember loving. He was the kind of person who apologized when he reached across you for a book, who folded his receipts neatly into his wallet, who noticed when the barista at the corner cafe changed her hair. I remember thinking, on our second date, that I had never met a man who listened so completely, who asked follow-up questions that showed he had really heard the first answer. We married 3 years later in a modest ceremony in my mother's backyard, under a string of lights my brother had spent 2 afternoons hanging, and I remember standing across from him thinking that whatever came next, we would be careful with each other. That word, careful, has followed me through our marriage like a companion. I think we were careful in the early years the way people are careful when they know love is fragile, and later we were careful in a different way, the way people are careful when they know that love is strong but truth is heavy and needs to be lifted together. I don't want to romanticize the beginning, because the beginning had its own troubles, the kind every marriage has, the disagreements about money, the negotiations about family visits, the small resentments that build when two people are learning to share a life. But underneath all of it was a steady sense that Daniel was a good person, and that I was safe, and that whatever the shape of our future might be, we would meet it together. For the first 15 years, our life looked, from the outside, like many other lives. We rented an apartment, then bought a small house, then adopted a dog we named Bishop who chewed through 2 pairs of my slippers before we understood he needed more exercise. I worked in a hospital administration office and Daniel worked in software, and we had the ordinary rhythm of ordinary people, dinners at 7, weekends at the hardware store, holidays that were sometimes joyful and sometimes exhausting. We tried for children and could not have them, and we grieved that quietly and privately, the way you grieve something no one else can fully see, and eventually we made a peace with it that was not resignation but a kind of gentle recalibration. We poured ourselves into each other, into work, into a garden that Daniel became unexpectedly devoted to, into small trips to lakes and mountains and museums, into the friendships we had built and were building. If you had asked me, at 40, whether I truly knew my husband, I would have said yes without hesitation. I would have been wrong, but not in the way you might think. I was not wrong because Daniel had been hiding something monstrous, or because our marriage had been a lie. I was wrong because there's a kind of knowing that only comes when the other person has been able to know themselves first, and Daniel had not yet been able to. The changes began so subtly that for a long time I filed them away as small quirks, the kind of shifts a middle-aged spouse might make without any particular reason. He began paying attention to fabrics in a new way. When we would walk through a department store, he would linger at scarves, feeling the weight of them between his fingers, and once he stood for a long time at a display of soft cardigans and said, quietly, that he liked the color of the pale blue one. I remember I made a small joke about him finally developing an eye for fashion, and he laughed, but his laugh had a note in it I did not recognize, a kind of thin, tight sound that lived somewhere between relief and embarrassment. I thought nothing of it at the time. There were other small changes. He grew his hair a little longer, not dramatically, just enough that it curled at the collar in a way he'd never allowed before. He started using a face cream he had bought without discussion, one that smelled faintly of chamomile, and when I teased him about it, he said, with unusual seriousness, that he had decided he wanted to take better care of his skin. He began listening to different music, softer music, the kind of quiet piano and cello arrangements that seemed to fill the house with a sense of contemplation rather than energy. None of this alarmed me. If anything, I found it endearing. I thought, he is settling into himself. He is becoming more thoughtful. We are entering the next chapter. But there were other changes I did not know how to interpret. He would sometimes leave the house on a Saturday morning without saying where he was going, and come back 3 hours later with no bags, no obvious purpose, and a strange quietness about him, as if he had been somewhere important and could not quite return to ordinary conversation. He began locking his laptop when he stepped away from it, something he had never done in our 16 years of marriage. He would occasionally seem to flinch when I walked into a room, as if I had interrupted something, though when I looked he was only reading or scrolling or sitting with his hands in his lap. I noticed once that a small paper bag from a store I did not recognize had been slipped behind the boots in our hall closet, and when I mentioned it in passing later that week, he said it was nothing, just a gift he was planning for a coworker, and I chose to believe him because the alternative was to begin an interrogation I was not ready to conduct. I am telling you these things not because I want you to think Daniel was deceitful in some grand way, but because I want to be honest about what it felt like, from my side, when someone I loved began to have a private inner life I could not see into. It is a lonely feeling that. It is a feeling that lives somewhere between fear and grief before you even know what you're afraid of, or what you might be grieving. There was a period, I think it lasted about 6 months, when I began to imagine the worst. I imagined an affair. I imagined a secret financial problem. I imagined an illness he was hiding from me. I did not accuse him of anything, because I had no evidence, and because I had promised myself early in our marriage that I would not become the kind of wife who transformed suspicion into proof by sheer force of will. But I did watch him more carefully than I had ever watched him before, and I hated myself a little for that watching, because it felt like a betrayal of the trust we had built, and yet I could not stop. I would notice when he came home smelling faintly of a perfume I did not own. I would notice when he seemed to be tired in a way that was not physical but emotional, when he would come into the kitchen at the end of an evening and stand at the counter with a glass of water and stare at nothing for a long time. Once, and I remember this with unusual clarity, I saw him standing in front of our bedroom mirror in the late afternoon, when he thought I was still at work, wearing an ordinary shirt but with his hair pulled back in a small clip he had never used before, and there was something in the expression on his face, something so tender and uncertain and hopeful, that I quietly stepped away before he saw me and stood in the hallway with my hand over my mouth, because I had understood, in that instant, that whatever was happening was not what I had feared. It was something else entirely, and I did not yet have the language for it, and neither did he. I want to pause here and speak honestly about what happened inside me during those weeks after that afternoon in the hallway, because I think that if this story has any value at all, it is in the honesty of the interior work. I was not immediately understanding. I was not immediately generous. I was first confused in a deep and disorienting way because everything I had assumed about my marriage and about the person I had married began to shift on its axis, and I did not know where the new axis was. I was also, and this shames me to admit, but I want to be truthful, a little bit angry, not at him, but at the situation, at the sense that I had missed something so important for so long, at the fear that our future might now be different from the future I had planned. I lay awake at night beside him and listened to his breathing and thought about the person I had married and the person he might be becoming, and I could not tell whether they were the same person or different people, and I did not know which answer would hurt more. I also felt, quietly, a kind of grief for the version of my life I had assumed I was living, which is a strange thing to grieve, because that life had not ended. It had only been revealed to be something more complicated than I had understood. I want anyone listening to this to know that if you are ever in a similar position, if someone you love is going through a change you did not expect, it is not a failure of love to feel confused, or afraid, or grieving. What matters is what you do with those feelings, whether you let them harden into judgment, or whether you allow them to soften into curiosity. For me, the softening began not in a moment of grand revelation but in a small, ordinary conversation on a Sunday evening. Daniel and I were sitting on the back porch, and Bishop was chasing something invisible in the grass, and the sky was the color of old peaches, and Daniel said, in a voice so quiet I almost did not hear him, that he had been thinking about something for a long time, and that he was afraid to talk about it, and that he did not want me to be hurt. I remember reaching for his hand, because I could feel the weight of what he was carrying, and I said something like, "Whatever it is, we can talk about it. I would rather know than not know." And he took a long breath and looked at the sky rather than at me, and he told me that for as long as he could remember, since he was very young, there had been a part of him that had always felt more feminine than the world had allowed him to be, and that he had spent his entire life pushing that part down, and that recently, in the last few years, he had begun to wonder whether he could allow it to exist, quietly, privately, in a way that did not disrupt our life, but that would let him breathe. He said the word crossdressing at one point, and he said it with such care, as if he were laying a fragile object on the table between us, and he watched my face for my reaction, and I did not know what my face was doing. He told me he did not know yet whether this was about clothing, or about identity, or about something larger. He only knew that he was tired of pretending it did not exist. And then he cried, my careful, gentle husband, cried in a way I had never seen him cry, not even at his father's funeral, and I put my arms around him and I held him and I said, "Thank you for telling me." And I meant it, even though I did not yet know what any of it would mean for us. The days that followed were not the days you see in dramatic movies about revelations. There was no sudden transformation, no dramatic reveal, no crisis of confidence. There was, instead, a kind of quiet unfolding, the way a book you have been reading for years suddenly begins to reveal a plot you had missed. Daniel and I began to talk slowly over many evenings about who he was and who he had been and who he was becoming. He told me about a memory from when he was 7 years old, when he had tried on his older sister's dress in the summer while she was away at camp, and how he had stood in front of the mirror and felt, for the first time in his short life, like the person in the mirror matched the person inside him, and how his mother had walked in and slapped him, not out of cruelty, but out of terror, and told him never to do it again, and how he had carried that shame like a small stone in his pocket for 40 years. He told me about the years in high school when he had learned to perform masculinity so thoroughly that he had almost convinced himself, about the times in college when he had tried, in secret, to explore what he felt, and had thrown everything away in a panic afterward, and prayed to be normal. He told me about the way he had loved me, truly and completely from the moment we met, and how he had hoped that love would be enough to make the other part of him disappear, and how, over time, he had come to understand that love was not something that erased parts of you, but something that, if it was real, made room for them. I want to say something about what I learned in those conversations, because I think this is where the story matters most, not for its details, but for its lessons. I learned that identity is not a costume. It is not something a person chooses in the way that a person chooses a jacket in the morning. It is something older and deeper than that, something that lives in the bones and the memory and the quiet places where language cannot always reach. I learned that when a person spends decades pushing down a part of themselves, that part does not disappear. It waits, and it grows heavier the longer it waits, and eventually it either breaks the person or breaks free. I learned that the courage it takes to speak such a thing aloud, especially to the person whose response matters most, is a kind of courage that deserves to be met with tenderness, whether or not the listener fully understands. And I learned, most importantly, that my role as his partner was not to fix him, not to approve or disapprove, not to grant permission, but simply to be present, to listen, to ask the questions I needed to ask without turning them into accusations, and to be honest about my own fears and uncertainties without making them his responsibility to soothe. I also had to do my own work, and I want to talk about that honestly, because I think we sometimes talk about identity exploration as if only the person exploring is doing the work, when in fact everyone around them who loves them is also going through their own reshaping. I had to sit with my own assumptions about masculinity and femininity, assumptions I had absorbed from my mother and my culture and my church and my school and every advertisement I had ever seen. I had to ask myself, honestly, why the idea of my husband wearing a dress had, at first, felt to me like a loss. Was it because I thought less of him? No, I did not think less of him. Was it because I feared what other people would think? Yes, partly, and I had to sit with that because caring what other people think is a way of letting other people write your life for you. Was it because I was afraid that if he was changing, I would lose the person I had loved? Yes, and this was the deepest fear, and it was the one that took the longest to work through. Because the truth is that people change all the time in marriages, in friendships, in families, and the question is not whether they change, but whether we are willing to keep meeting them as they change, whether we are willing to be curious about the new person emerging rather than mourning only the old one. I had to ask myself whether I loved Daniel because of the specific arrangement of the traits he had shown me, or whether I loved him because of who he was underneath those traits. And when I sat with that question long enough, I realized that I loved him for something that went deeper than any surface, and that I could love that same something in whatever expression it needed to take. There were still difficult days, and I want to be honest about those because pretending it was all smooth would be dishonest. There was a night when I came home earlier than expected and found him in a soft, long cardigan and a simple skirt he had bought at a thrift store 2 towns over, and my first reaction, before my brain could catch up, was to step back, and he saw that flinch, and it hurt him, and it hurt me that I had hurt him, and we spent the next several hours talking through it. I had to explain that the flinch was not rejection but surprise, that my body had reacted before my heart, and he had to explain that the flinch, even understood, was something he had feared all his life. We learned in that conversation that we would need to be patient with each other, that neither of us was going to be perfect, that love in this new territory meant giving each other the grace to have imperfect first reactions and then to talk them through. There was another day, a few months later, when he asked me if I thought he should tell his sister, and I did not know what to say, because his sister lived in a small town and held opinions that had, in the past, been unkind, and I was afraid for him. We talked about it for weeks. We eventually decided he would not tell her yet, not because he was ashamed, but because he was not obligated to hand over his interior life to anyone who had not shown they could hold it carefully. This was, I think, one of the most important lessons I learned during this time. That self-disclosure is not a moral requirement, that a person's identity is their own to share on their own timing, that privacy is not the same as secrecy, and that a person who chooses to keep parts of themselves for themselves is not being deceptive, but is being wise about the world they live in. We also had to think about our marriage and about what it meant, and about whether the vows we had made still fit. And here I want to say something that I did not expect to be able to say when this all began. The vows fit better now than they ever had. Because the vows had never been about the specific gender presentation of my husband. The vows had been about honoring, cherishing, standing beside, being honest with, growing with. And in fact, in this new season, we were doing all of those things more intentionally than we had ever done them before. We talked more. We listened more. We touched each other with more attention, not less. We laughed more, actually, because there was a lightness in our house that had not been there before, a sense that a secret we had all been carrying, even the ones we did not know we were carrying, had been set down. Daniel began, over the following year, to explore his expression in ways that felt right to him. Some days he wore ordinary clothes to work and lived, in the public eye, as the man he had always presented as. Other evenings and weekends, at home or with a small circle of trusted friends, he allowed himself to dress in ways that made him feel more like himself. Softer sweaters, longer skirts, a small pair of earrings his mother had left him and that he had, for years, kept in a drawer without knowing why he could not bear to give them away. He did not want, at least not then, to make any public declaration. He wanted, he said, to live his life at his own pace, in his own way, with the people who had earned the right to know him fully. I want to speak now about the question of whether this was cross-dressing or something more, because I know that from the outside these categories can feel important and neat, and from the inside they can feel much less so. For a long time, Daniel used the word cross-dressing because it was the word he had learned first, the word he had come across in furtive late-night reading years ago, the word that felt safe because it seemed to describe a behavior rather than an identity. Over time, as he continued to explore, he began to wonder whether the word fit him, whether what he was doing was really about clothing at all, or whether it was about something deeper, whether he might be, in some meaningful way, transitioning toward a fuller expression of a feminine self that had always lived inside him. He did not rush to that conclusion. He was thoughtful and careful, and he sought out a therapist who specialized in gender identity, someone kind and unhurried, and he spent many months in that therapy exploring not what he should call himself, but who he actually was, underneath all the labels. I remember he came home from one of those sessions and said to me, "The therapist told me I don't have to know today. She said the only thing I have to do is keep listening to myself." And I thought that was one of the wisest things I had ever heard. Because so much of the pressure we feel, especially about identity, is the pressure to arrive somewhere final, to be a fixed and knowable thing, and yet the truth of a human life is that we are always becoming, always learning, always being more accurately seen by ourselves and others. Eventually, and this took another 2 years, Daniel came to a clearer sense of who he was. He shared with me, quietly one autumn evening, that she thought of herself, inwardly as a woman, that she had, in fact, always thought of herself that way in some deep and unspoken place, and that she wanted to begin, slowly and carefully, to live in a way that honored that truth. She told me, with tears in her eyes, that she was terrified I would leave, and that she would not blame me if I did, because she knew this was not what I had signed up for. And I remember taking her hand and saying, "I signed up for you. I have always been signing up for you. I am still signing up for you." I do not want to make that moment sound easier than it was. I had my own fears. I had my own grief for the specific version of our life that would now be shaped differently. But I had also spent those years doing my own work, and I had come to understand that what I loved was not the outer shape of my partner, but the inner shape, the humor, the tenderness, the way she still folded her receipts neatly into her wallet, the way she still noticed when the barista changed her hair. Those things had not changed. Those things were the person I had married. Everything else was just clothing, in a manner of speaking, and clothing is not what a marriage is made of. The years since have been quieter than you might expect, and I think that is worth saying, because our culture sometimes tells stories about identity as if they are always dramatic, always public, always accompanied by upheaval. Ours has not been. Daniel, or rather the person I now know as my wife, whose chosen name is Danielle, made her transition gradually and in a way that fit her. She told her closest friends first, and most of them received the news with love. A few did not, and those friendships either ended or became more distant, and we grieved those losses honestly and moved on. She told her sister eventually, and her sister was, to our surprise, more accepting than we had feared, and they have built a new and gentler relationship in the years since. She did not tell everyone at work. She made the decision to change jobs a few years in, to a place where she could begin fresh as herself. And that transition, professionally, went more smoothly than she had dared hope. She began medical steps at her own pace, with her doctor's guidance, and she made those choices with care and reflection. I supported her through each of them, not because I had any particular opinion about which steps she should take, but because I had learned that my role was to walk beside, not to lead. She and I still live in the same house, still garden together, still watch bad movies on Friday nights, still argue about the thermostat, still fold the laundry in slightly different ways. Bishop is old now, and sleeps by the door most days. Our life is, in the ways that matter, the same life we always had, only more honest and more spacious and more true. I want to talk, before I close, about the lessons I think this experience has given me, because I believe that stories are only worth telling if they leave the listener with something they can carry into their own lives. The first lesson is that we do not always know the people we love as fully as we think we do, and that this is not a failure of love but a feature of being human. Every person carries within them a private life, a set of thoughts and feelings and questions that they have not yet found the words for, and to love someone is to be willing to encounter those private lives as they emerge, without punishing the person for having kept them private. The second lesson is that identity is not a threat. When someone in your life begins to explore who they are not taking something from you. They are, if anything, offering you a fuller version of themselves, and your job, if you want to remain in relationship with them, is to be curious rather than defensive. The third lesson is that the work of accepting another person is inseparable from the work of accepting yourself. I could not have met my wife where she needed to be met if I had not been willing to examine my own assumptions, my own fears, my own inherited ideas about who people are allowed to be. That work was hard, and it was not glamorous, and it did not happen in a single dramatic evening. It happened over years, in small conversations with myself, in journals, in a therapist's office, in quiet walks with Bishop through the neighborhood at dusk. The fourth lesson is about patience. When a person has spent decades hiding a part of themselves, they cannot be expected to fully understand that part in a matter of weeks or months. Neither can their partner. Neither can their family. Identity exploration is a slow, careful, sometimes circuitous process, and the people around the explorer need to allow time, to allow uncertainty, to allow the person to not know exactly who they are yet. This is one of the great gifts you can give someone, the permission to be in progress. The fifth lesson is about responsibility. This is one I want to speak about carefully because it is easy to misunderstand. Daniel, who is now Danielle, always felt a deep responsibility toward me and toward our marriage and toward the truth. She never lied to me in a way that was intended to harm me. She withheld things because she did not yet have language for them, and as soon as she had that language, she brought it to me. There is a difference between deception and unreadiness, and I think this is an important distinction to hold on to. She did not take her exploration as a license to disregard the promises we had made. If anything, she took it as an invitation to renew those promises more deeply. And I, in turn, took her openness as an invitation to be more open myself, to be honest about my own fears rather than letting them fester, to bring my discomforts into conversation rather than into resentment. This is what I mean by responsibility and identity exploration, not the responsibility to conform or to suppress, but the responsibility to be honest, to communicate, to bring the people who love you along with you in whatever way they can be brought along. The sixth lesson, and perhaps the most difficult one, is about the outside world. Not everyone will be kind. Not everyone will understand. There are people who will see a person like my wife and see only what they have been taught to see, and they will react from fear or ignorance or unexamined prejudice. There are family members who will pull back, colleagues who will whisper, strangers who will stare. This is a reality, and I do not want to pretend it isn't. But I have also learned that there are far more kind people in the world than the loud voices sometimes suggest. There are neighbors who have knocked on our door with jars of homemade jam and said nothing about our lives except to ask how we were. There are old friends who have sent letters saying they were proud of us. There are strangers who, in the aisle of a grocery store, have complimented a scarf or asked about a garden and treated us exactly as they would have treated anyone else. The world contains cruelty, but it also contains an enormous, quiet, ordinary generosity, and I have come to trust in that generosity more than I trust in my own fear. I have also learned that we do not need every person to accept us in order to build a good life. We need a few people, the right people, and we need to protect our own peace from those who would disturb it without reason. I want to say a word to anyone listening who might themselves be in the position my wife was in for so many years, carrying a part of themselves in silence, afraid of what would happen if they spoke. I am not going to tell you what to do, because I do not know your life, and I have learned that unsolicited advice is one of the least useful things one human can offer another. But I will say this. You deserve to be known. You deserve to be known by yourself, first, before anyone else, and that knowing is a slow and gentle process that does not need to be rushed. You deserve to find, when the time is right, someone you trust enough to speak your truth to, whether that is a partner or a therapist or a friend or a support group. You deserve to take your time, to be uncertain, to change your mind, to explore before you conclude. And you deserve to be gentle with the people around you, too, understanding that they may need their own time to catch up, that their initial reactions may not be their final reactions, that love sometimes moves slowly through the human heart before it arrives at understanding. Give them a chance. Give yourself a chance. And if the people around you cannot rise to the occasion, know that there are others out there who will, and that the world is larger and kinder than the small circle you may have been born into. I want to say a word, too, to anyone listening who is on the other side of a story like this, who is a partner or a parent or a sibling of someone exploring their identity. Your feelings are also real, and they also deserve care. It is okay to be confused. It is okay to be sad, at first, for the version of your life you thought you were living. It is okay to need time, to need help, to need to speak to a therapist yourself. What is not okay, in my experience, is to weaponize those feelings against the person you love, to make them responsible for soothing your fears while they are trying to understand themselves. Find your own supports. Do your own work. Ask honest questions and be willing to hear honest answers. Remember that the person in front of you is still the person you loved. They are only, now, more fully themselves, and if you can find a way to love that fuller self, you will not lose them. You will discover them. Looking back now, from this quiet Tuesday afternoon, from this house that has held so much, from this life that turned out to be different from and better than the life I had imagined, I feel a kind of gratitude that surprises me. Gratitude for the confusion because it forced me to look at my own assumptions. Gratitude for the fear because it revealed what I actually valued when I was stripped of my certainties. Gratitude for the small changes I noticed in Daniel all those years ago. The fabrics, the music, the face cream, the pale blue cardigan he lingered over in the department store, because those small changes were, in retrospect, the first quiet steps of a person walking home to themselves. Gratitude for the courage it took my wife to speak, and for the patience she showed with me as I learned. Gratitude for the friends and therapists and neighbors and strangers who made this journey livable. And gratitude, most of all, for the ordinary evenings we have now, the way we still sit on the back porch as the light changes, the way she still reaches for my hand without looking, the way Bishop still snores by the door, the way our life, which once seemed so fragile, has revealed itself to be sturdier than I ever knew. I have come to believe that a marriage is not a contract about who each person will always be. It is a promise about how you will meet each other as you both change. I have come to believe that identity is not a performance we put on for the world. It is a truth we uncover slowly over years, with the help of people who are willing to see us. I have come to believe that the greatest gift you can give another person is not agreement but presence, the willingness to stay in the room when the conversation is hard, the willingness to keep listening when what you are hearing surprises you. I have come to believe that self-acceptance and the acceptance of others are the same skill, practiced in different directions, and that a person who cannot forgive themselves for being complicated will struggle to allow others to be complicated too. I have come to believe that patience is a form of love, that curiosity is a form of respect, and that silence, when chosen with care, can sometimes hold more than speech. If you are watching this and you take away one thing, I hope it is not the details of my story but the shape of it. The shape of a person carrying something in silence for a long time, then finding the courage to speak. The shape of a partner learning to listen, imperfectly at first, then more fully. The shape of a marriage that did not end when it changed but deepened. The shape of a life that turned out to be more spacious than either of us had imagined. There are so many people out there, right now, in houses like mine, in marriages like mine, sitting at kitchen tables with words in their mouths they are afraid to say. There are so many partners on the other side of those tables, waiting to hear something they do not yet know they will hear. My hope in telling you this story is not that you will do anything in particular, but that you will feel a little less alone if you recognize yourself in any part of it, and that you will feel a little more prepared if someone you love ever needs to be heard. I am going to stop now because I think I have said what I came to say, and because Danielle will be home from her walk soon, and we have promised each other we will make dinner together tonight. She has been experimenting with a new soup recipe, and I have been trying to learn to bake bread that does not come out like a brick, and there is a small chance that the combination of these two efforts will produce something edible. Bishop will get his usual scraps. The light will fade slowly across the wooden floor. We will sit at the table and talk about nothing in particular, or about everything, and neither of us will be pretending. That is the gift of the road we have walked. That is what I would wish for anyone. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.